Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. In this series, we explore the history of medicine from A to Z, taking you on a journey from autopsies to zoonosis. Our wide range of topics includes diseases and treatments, plants and chemicals, and myths and curiosities. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Physicians Gallery podcast as we explore the history of medicine from A to Z. My name is Daisy Cunynghame and I am the Physicians Gallery Heritage Manager.
And my name's Olivia Howarth and I'm a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And today we've made it to you. So, my you is ugliness. So, I'm talking about human ugliness. I'm not talking about ugly architecture, art, ugly fashion, anything like this. We're talking about people. So, first of all, to state the obvious, ugliness is not impartial, it is not objective. When we describe a person as ugly, it says something about us and our fears and our biases. It doesn't reflect on the person who we are talking about. And of course, you can't separate ideas around ugliness from people's prejudices relating to class, gender, disability, race, all those sorts of things. And ugliness, as we all know, is viewed as being tied into age, health, body weight, things like that. So we have talked in more than one previous episode about Victorian Britain and how much of a focus there was on being quote-unquote normal. So there was a real othering of people with disabilities or people who were viewed as having unconventional appearances in society. And describing a person as ugly is a very effective way to other them, to make it clear that they don't fit in with whatever the societal norms are at that time. So in different times in history, red hair has been viewed as both ugly and as beautiful. The same with blue eyes, being left-handed, having wide-set eyes. You know, there's a lot of things that in one era of history can be positive or even beautiful, and the same attribute in another period was seen as negative and possibly ugly. The example that a lot of us are probably thinking of is the way that fatness has been viewed as beautiful, say in the 17th century Europe, and is not so today. Blackened teeth is another example where in parts of Asia, before the mid-19th century, blackening your teeth was a way of being beautiful. That's very simplification. There's more meaning behind that as well, but it wasn't viewed as inherently unattractive. So almost any external bodily feature can be designated as ugly in a given moment. The word ugly itself has Old Norse roots and it essentially means to be feared. So it has this inherently negative and scary meaning to it. In ancient Greece and even into medieval times, ugliness is associated with dishonesty, not being trustworthy, and possibly even being evil. There was this idea that who you were on the inside was reflected in how you looked on the outside. So if you were a negative person on the inside, that would make you ugly according to this logic. And you get a lot of discussions about part human, part monster people. And also beautiful people being transformed into beasts. There's a lot of sort of warning stories, poems and mythology that's almost sort of supposed to educate people or make them think and avoid risk. You know, if you do a bad thing, you will be physically ugly as a result. The Roman author Pliny the Elder wrote about monstrous people, faces in their chests, the head of a dog, people who had enormous ears that dragged on the ground. This idea of these incredibly ugly people, incredibly strange and monstrous people permeated quite far. And it became a sort of shorthand. So in medieval Europe, if you saw a tapestry or a painting that had ugly people in it, this could be shorthand for spiritual damnation. So it's getting across an idea. If you see a stained glass window, if you see a tapestry with incredibly ugly looking people in it, incredibly atypical looking people in it, you understood what that meant. You understood the story that was being told to you. Most commonly, women were described as ugly more often than men, and ugliness could be tied to accusations of witchcraft. So it is something that gets referred to in, formal documents. They had certain attributes. They had large noses. They had a lot of warts or moles. They had these physical attributes that suggested that they were witches, and also tied in with these ideas of ugliness as well. And when you move into the Georgian period, so 1700s Britain, it starts becoming something that is more discussed, perhaps more open. A number of what are called ugly face clubs are founded. So this time period, 1700s Britain, is really the height of gentlemen's club culture. So you have tennis clubs, golf clubs, drinking clubs, and you have drinking clubs specifically for physicians or lawyers or politicians, and you have drinking clubs specifically for ugly people. And as with, all the other clubs, these are gentlemen's clubs, so these are specifically for men. And it is true that the level of stigma attached to ugliness is always more for women because it is seen as impacting on their marriageability and so on. It's interesting that this group of men, not to say that it wasn't a struggle for them as well, but there's almost a level of pride involved in being a member of the ugly club. The club where the most information survives for is the Liverpool Ugly Face Club. It's established in 1743, and in the membership documents, it describes the members based on what animal they supposedly resembled. So you would be listed in the membership documentation as being the shark man, the pig, the badger, and so on. All supposedly who you resemble or what you resembled. The ugliness had to be facial ugliness, and that's the same with most of these clubs. You couldn't be missing a leg or something like that. You had to be considered to have an ugly face. It was very specific on that. But other than that, they were fairly typical drinking clubs. So moving into the 19th century, in certain cities in the United States of America, starting from around the 1860s, there are a series of ugly laws passed. So the technical name for these laws is the Unsightly Beggar Ordinances. The ugly laws is how they are described, but that wasn't what they were called. But these laws banned people who were visibly deformed from being out in public. So, for example, a San Francisco law banned, quote, any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or deformed in any way so as to be unsightly or disgusting, to expose himself or herself to public view. So it's literally saying you are not supposed to leave your house.
That's so bizarre. Because I know in terms of things like leprosy, you'd say you can't be in public because of the spread of disease, and we'll give you a community where you can function as a society but not transmit disease. But that's purely based on aesthetics.
It's difficult to picture how you would have been able to survive in that situation. How do you earn a living? How do you do anything? And I think that's the point. I think, from what I understand, they're trying to push people out of these cities. By criminalizing being in this city, they want you to leave and go to a different place. Because you cannot live your life in any way in this situation if you can't leave your house. Now, what we don't know is how effective this was. So it was certainly attempts where, they made attempts to implement it, but whether it was genuinely effective across the board is very difficult to know. But it wasn't only San Francisco. So there were similar laws brought in New Orleans, Portland, Chicago, Denver, Colorado, Columbus, Ohio, and the entire state of Pennsylvania. So it wasn't across the entirety of the US, but there were a number of places that were doing this. And so if you were disabled, you had to be able to successfully hide your disability. So if you were lame, could you move somehow without limping, even if it caused you pain? And if your disability could not be hidden, you were supposed to stay indoors. And there was one category that was generally exempt from these laws, which was freak shows. So you were allowed to have a job outdoors if you joined a freak show. There were already displays of severely disabled people happening before this time. It was, it had a long history, but these laws really increased the number of disabled people working in freak shows, and they were either touring freak shows, which were often part of circuses or carnivals, but other ones were based in museums, so they were static freak shows. So, for example, at the Globe Museum in New York, there was a young man called Fedor, I'm so sorry for the pronunciation of this, Jeffischu. That's so far off the bat. But he was known colloquially as Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy. And he would perform between 20 and 30 shows a day. So I think that's also, to me, very important, is that when we think about these sort of freak shows, we're often picturing a very carnival-style travelling show. And yes, those existed, but what were viewed as reputable museums were also hosting these. So what's your you then, Olivia?
I've gone for Urticaria. So the word Urticaria comes from the Latin urere, I think is how you say it, to burn, and urtica, which is nettle. This is because classical presentation of Urticaria can come from contact with stinging nettles, which is also called Urtica dioica, I think, dioica. So now we commonly refer to Urticaria as hives. So I've slightly cheated the system here, and I will be using Urticaria and hives interchangeably throughout this talk. Urticaria, or hives, is a skin reaction characterized by sudden appearance of very itchy, slightly raised, smooth, flat top wheals and plaques that are usually redder or paler than the surrounding skin. Hives is a common skin condition that occurs when a trigger causes high levels of histamine and other chemicals to be released into the skin. Triggers can include eating certain foods, so food allergies are probably the most frequent cause of acute urticaria. Other triggers include things like contact with certain plants, animals, chemicals and latex, colds such as cold water or wind, hot sweaty skin from exercise, emotional stress or eating spicy food, a reaction to a medicine, insect bite or sting, scratching or pressing on your skin, an infection, a problem with your immune system, and water or sunlight, but that's quite rare. To get slightly technical for a very short amount of time, it's the mast cells lining the blood vessels contain histamine, which is released following the contact of those mast cells with the irritating substance. Histamine in turn increases the permeability of the capillaries so that plasma escapes into the spaces between the cells of the skin, which causes the swellings. And the itching is also thought to be caused by the histamine. But on with the history bit, because that's the bit that we like. Many different names have been applied to urticaria, either based on its presentation or on its presumed cause. The earliest reference dates from 1000 to 2000 BCE in an ancient Chinese medical text called Huang Di Nei Jing, and in that it's called Feng Yin Zeng, which means wind-type concealed rash, and was thought to be due to excess in lesser yin caused by an obstruction of fluid in the skin. Hippocrates described itching lesions caused by nettles and mosquitoes, which he called, I think we're going to pronounce this wrong, but I'm going to go for it, cnidosis? Could also be nidosis. After the Greek word for nettle, cnido, or nido, he also mentions that the wheals occur in patients with gastrointestinal disorders, but often with mild itching. In his book King Richard III, Thomas More gives a description of the condition. In 1480, some lords hoped to please the future King Richard by serving him strawberries, and a few hours later he assembled the lords to show them his chest, which was covered with red, elevated and itching spots, and he accuses one of them of trying to poison him and has them executed. The word urticaria specifically has its roots with Pliny the Elder, who introduced the name uredo, which means burning, but much later in the 18th century, Johann Heinrich Zeidler changed uredo to urticario in his German encyclopedia Grosses Vorstadiges Universal Lexikon aller Wissenschaften and Künste, or the great universal lexicon of all sciences and arts. However, it was, drumroll, friend of the pod, William Cullen, who first introduced the word urticaria in his book Synopsia Nosologiae Methodica in 1769. And although the first medical text specifically written on the skin date from the 1500s, it was only at this time, in the late 1700s, that dermatology began to be viewed as a specialised branch of study. Cullen, professor of medicine in Edinburgh, started to classify skin disorders in the same way that Linnaeus had done with plants, and Robert Willan, an English physician who studied at the University of Edinburgh and came under the influence of Cullen's ideas, wrote his own classification of cutaneous diseases based on the morphology of lesions. His work was completed by his assistant and successor, Thomas Bateman, who published a practical synopsis of cutaneous diseases in 1819, and together, Bateman and Willan's work was the first modern attempt to classify and properly define skin diseases in Britain, and was influential at home and abroad. So I know that you've mentioned this book in the past and present episode on dermatology, but I thought it was interesting that it describes several different types of urticaria, including urticaria febrilis, where the patient has fever and abdominal pain for some days before skin lesions appear, urticaria evenida, where new lesions can continue to appear for many months or years, and most of the itching occurs at night, urticaria perstans, where the single central wheal remains for some days and feels hard, but the initial reddening around the wheal disappears. Not everyone accepted Bateman and Willan's classification system. In this regard, Jean-Louis Alibert preferred the Greek word knidos and advocated the classification of it based on the etiology of the disease. Urticaria, as we understand it today, is based on the discovery of the mast cell by Paul Ehrlich in 1879, the messenger substance histamine by Adolf Windhaus in 1907, and immunoglobulin E, the antibody produced by the body's immune system, by the working groups led by Kimishige Ishizaka and Stig Gunnar Olof Johansson in 1965. Factitial urticaria, it's also known as dermatographism. It's a common condition that causes itchy welts to appear on the skin when it's rubbed, scratched, or otherwise irritated, and the welts appear in the shape of the force applied to the skin, usually appearing quickly and lasting for 1 to 2 hours. So it's sometimes called skin writing, and it was described by William Heberden in his 1767 paper of the nettle rash. And in 1859, William Gull inscribed the name factitious urticaria to distinguish dermatographism from chronic urticaria, in which skin lesions appear spontaneously. During the 1870s, French physicians at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris were intrigued by their ability to write words on the bodies of patients admitted with hysteria and other mental illnesses, who also exhibited dermatographism. It was assumed by some that the phenomenon of skin writing was a manifestation of a psychological disorder. And at the Salpêtrière and elsewhere in the world, it became fashionable to photograph patients with dermatographism to capture the striking urticarial writing on their skin. Those photographs were used in atlases and to illustrate dermatology texts and medical journals, as well as popular magazines. Historical treatments for hives have involved topical applications of cool compresses, oatmeal baths, and herbal remedies like stinging nettle, chamomile, and calendula used topically as infusions or poultices to alleviate the itching. More systematic approaches would include dietary modifications and avoiding potential triggers, with the understanding of allergies and histamine release being gradually developed over time.
So my final U is universal medicine. The idea of universal medicine is something we've talked about in quite a few episodes before. So this is the idea that you can find one single medicine which will cure or at least alleviate all diseases. So we've seen it when we talked about electricity, radium, mercury, unicorn horn, quinine, and arguably even antibiotics. This idea that there is this one medicine. But I'm going to go back to the first example of an attempt to find a universal medicine, which is alchemy. So often when people talk about alchemy, they talk about the idea of turning base metals into gold. So that's sort of the stereotype of alchemy, is this turning lead into gold. But there is a second and historically equally important aim of alchemy, which is to create a universal medicine. Often this is called the elixir of life, which will bring permanent good health and if you're lucky, even immortality if you make it right. So just to start with a little bit of context, I realize that a lot of people will have an idea of alchemy, but just a little bit of context. So the first alchemical texts in Europe came to us through Arabic writings. So it came from Arabic origins, but we really took it on to an extra level of intensity. So by the mid-1200s, European authors have begun to write their own alchemical texts. But those early books, they often are using Arabic pseudonyms because that gives it an extra air of credibility. There's an understanding that these Arabic texts are more accurate or more believable, have more credibility than the European texts. And alchemists were aware that if they succeeded either in making gold or in developing this elixir, that there would be real risks to their health and their wealth, that people would want to take it from them. And so alchemy is really built around a lot of symbols, a lot of allegories, a lot of riddles to keep knowledge secret. So it's very difficult to decipher an alchemical text. And that's not just me coming up with an excuse for why I can't do it. People with a far more knowledge and expertise than me also cannot decipher these texts. There's, the elephant means one thing, but a symbol of a dragon means something else. Unless it's the dragon is red coloured, in which case it means a third thing. There are moons and lions and all sorts of different symbols that do not mean one thing. They mean many different things depending on the exact context in which they're used. So given that we are recording this in Scotland, just to point out that Scotland has a particularly strong alchemical history. So over 500 years ago, King James IV set up an alchemical laboratory in Stirling Castle, and the aim was to find the material or the essence which would allow him to both turn metals into gold and find the secret to immortality. So the four established elements were fire, air, earth, and water. But the Stirling alchemists believed there was a fifth element or a fifth essence which could be added to the mix. I said that and I'm now suddenly thinking of the film A Fifth Element, but
I was thinking the exact same thing. I was like, it's love, the fifth element's love.
Well, it's close, because according to the surviving accounts from Stirling Castle, one of the ingredients, the main ingredient they used in large quantities to make this essence was whiskey. I don't know why I said that whiskey is close to love, but in my mind it is. You have enough and you feel it. According to the record, whiskey, when distilled unto 1,000 times, could achieve this fifth essence. So John Damien, who was King James IV's chief alchemist, attempted to fly from Stirling Castle to Paris using movable wings. This is the sort of mindset, I think, of an alchemist. He crash-landed directly below the castle, so there was no flying involved, there was only falling, breaking his leg in the process. But he explained that the reason it didn't work was not because his plan was bad, but it was because he had requested the feathers of eagles and he has given the feathers of chickens. But if he had been given the right feathers, he would have flown to Paris. But the Scottish connection continues. So not only were people like Damien interested in alchemy, but so were many early Scottish scientists, like John Napier, who was a celebrated mathematician and physicist in the 1500s. And because alchemy was very data-driven, it was very focused on numbers and calculations and analysis, a lot of early alchemists were very connected with maths, with physics. So there is a sort of segue from this interest in alchemy into the early Scottish sciences, and there is a really strong history in Scotland of chemistry and mathematics. So to get on to the medicine element of all of this, the elixir of life, variously also known as the elixir of immortality, the water of life, the fountain of life. So there are different versions of how this is supposed to work. So in some versions, it grants eternal life. In other versions, it grants eternal youth, which is quite different. Being alive forever is different from being young forever. And other versions just say it cures all diseases, so you would still eventually die of old age, but you would not develop diseases along the way. So a very early version can be found about 4,000 years ago in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in this, Gilgamesh is told to find a particular plant at the bottom of the sea, and this will grant him eternal life. But there are also versions of the elixir in ancient Chinese and Indian cultures, which have quite different roots, it seems, to the Western alchemy. Now, given all of this, perhaps unsurprisingly, there is no clear bullet point list recipe for how to make the elixir of life. You're not going to find a nice, handy how-to guide. So one claim involves honey, another says you need mercury. One quite common version was you need to get your hands on the Philosopher's Stone first, and then mix that with mercury. But the Philosopher's Stone is a whole other story by itself, because that all that does is make the impossible problem one step further back by going, just take this thing, but it's a thing that is also unknown how to make. A lot of references talk about renewal. So you get descriptions of snakes shedding their skin, you have to take that skin. Birds getting new plumage, you have to take the old feathers. And the suggestion is that it allows humans, either literally in some cases or figuratively, to shed their old skin and have younger skin underneath. I prefer it when it's figurative. When they describe it literally, it's not very nice. Some recipes make a bit more sense, so some of them have things like cinnamon and aniseed mixed with wine. But I found one recipe, this is a Welsh recipe which dates from the 1600s, and just to give you a little bit of an insight into how alchemists would describe what they were doing, I thought I'd describe to you a recipe to make this elixir of life. So this is a quote. 10 parts of slime, separate the male from the female, and each afterwards from its own earth. Physically, mark you, and with no violence, conjoin after separation in due harmonic vital proportions, and straightway the soul descending from the sphere shall restore by embrace its dead and deserted body. So that's do that, Olivia. But this is very typical. This is how it is written. So every single section in it has a separate meaning. It doesn't say take some wine and take some what have you. It's not a standard recipe. Every single section, you have to know so many other things to have any idea what it is talking about. And that is the sort of universal medicine recipe that you can expect to find in alchemy. Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.